This is the creature we use to study regeneration, called an axolotl. Hello, I'm Shafik, and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the fascinating secrets that nature has hidden in the pond. And one of those secrets pertains to a remarkable amphibian, or as they're known in the scientific world, the axolotl. It means water monster in the Aztec language. And of course, as a certified biology enthusiast, I've done my fair bit of research on these amazing creatures, right? Just off the top of my head, I've read countless papers, watched hours of documentaries, and even visited labs where they study axolotls, so I know what I'm talking about. But when it comes to axolotls, whether you're just looking for a quick biology lesson or something more in-depth, it is worth learning that these creatures aren't necessarily the same as other amphibians you might be familiar with. And so, without further ado, let's metaphorically dive into the pond as I uncover the incredible life cycle of the axolotl. You know, when I first laid eyes on an axolotl, I couldn't believe how alien-like it looked. I mean, here's this creature with a perpetual smile, frilly gills, and the ability to regrow lost limbs. Lawrence, what do you mean by that? Well, here's how axolotls work. We'll get into their superpowers later, but first, let's start at the beginning of their life cycle. In the murky waters of Mexico City's ancient canals, our story begins with axolotl eggs. These tiny jelly-like spheres are carefully laid by female axolotls, usually attached to aquatic plants or other surfaces. Each egg is a potential new axolotl, a future water monster in the making, and this is where the magic starts. Within each egg, a tiny embryo begins to develop. It's like watching a miniature alien take shape. The embryo grows, forming a head, a tail, and tiny buds that will eventually become legs. It's a process that takes about 2 weeks, give or take a few days depending on water temperature. And then just when you think nothing could be more fascinating than watching these eggs, they hatch. And this is where those pan-aquatic differences really take shape, or should I say size. Because there's one key rule: axolotl larvae are incredibly tiny when they first hatch. And the reason for this, as we all know, is that they need to be small enough to hide from predators. But it's also because they need to conserve energy as they begin their journey into axolotlehood. A newly hatched axolotl larva was where I first realized just how incredible these creatures are. They're about the size of your fingernail, with a long, transparent body and visible organs. At this stage, they look more like tiny fish than the smiling salamanders we're familiar with. And at the best of times, I don't like being in close proximity to creatures that can regrow their own limbs. But being amazed by these tiny larvae was the second most exciting experience of my life. And I know what you're thinking. Ooh, Alex, what was the first watching them metamorphose into their adult form? But we'll get to that later. You see, axolotl larvae, like many amphibian young, start their lives as aquatic creatures. They have external gills that look like little feathery plumes on either side of their head. These gills allow them to breathe underwater, extracting oxygen from the water around them. I mean, they'd have to, right? Especially given what we've discovered on this channel about the differences in aquatic respiration. And of course, gills are not the only fascinating feature of axolotl larvae, and I know what you're thinking. Yes, Alex, the axolotl larvae have a tail fin for swimming. Well, firstly, that's not always true. And secondly, that's not where I was going with this. I was actually going to mention their diet because while adult axolotls are known for their voracious appetites, the larvae start off much more modestly. To go from newly hatched to juvenile, they often have to kind of step up their eating game. There's one thing to remember: getting food, but getting enough of it when you're competing with your siblings could lead to an unintentionally hilarious feeding frenzy. In fact, I do have footage, but I can't show it on here because I get hundreds of complaints about how cute it is and an equal number of requests to adopt an axolotl. So just take my word for it. As the larvae grow, they begin to develop their iconic features. Their legs start to form, first as tiny buds, then growing into fully functional limbs. Their bodies elongate and their heads begin to take on that characteristic axolotl shape. It's like watching a transformer, but instead of turning into a car, it's turning into a smiling salamander. You can't talk about axolotl development without talking about neoteny. Neoteny is the retention of juvenile features in the adult form of an animal. And the only reason I made a scientific term there was to draw your attention to the fact that axolotls are basically the Peter Pans of the amphibian world. And they never grow up, at least not in the way other salamanders do. Anyway, there are several key differences in this department. While most salamanders metamorphose into a terrestrial adult form, axolotls retain their aquatic features throughout their lives. This makes them unique and incredibly fascinating to study. How do I know that? Because I was a biology student once. But whereas most salamanders lose their gills and develop lungs, that's not always the case with axolotls. Sure, they can be induced to metamorphose under certain conditions, but in their natural habitat, they remain in their aquatic juvenile form their entire lives. But axolotls, which are easily the more outgoing and competitive of the salamander world, are perfectly content to stay in their larval form. Due to the manner in which they've evolved, there's also a difference in how they adapt to their environment. In nature, the perpetual juvenile state allows them to thrive in their aquatic habitat. And the neotenic features mean that you can do this in theory, but it's not recommended to try and make them metamorphose artificially. One of the biggest concerns for axolotl enthusiasts, aside from being forced to pronounce their name correctly, is the great axolotl metamorphosis debate. In labs, axolotls can be induced to metamorphose by adding thyroid hormones to their water. Moreover, some axolotls in the wild occasionally undergo a natural metamorphosis. What does all of this mean? Well, let's just say that you want to see a metamorphosed axolotl, but it doesn't happen naturally in your tank. In that instance, you'll need to run to the pet store to pick up some iodine supplements. An iodine supplement will help stimulate the thyroid gland to produce the hormones needed for metamorphosis. In the event that your iodine supplement doesn't come with clear instructions, be sure to also pick up a guide on axolotl care. This guide is magic. It allows you to turn your aquatic axolotl into a terrestrial salamander. For axolotls in the wild, the same applies but in reverse. A natural metamorphosis might also be needed to survive in changing environmental conditions. Both are rare occurrences for axolotls in their natural habitat. I'd say the most obvious difference between larval and adult axolotls is the size. When I first saw an adult axolotl, I couldn't believe how big it was, and not in a Godzilla type way. I mean, this was a creature that started life smaller than my fingernail, and now it was the size of my forearm. But in nature, you don't usually have that problem and or luxury because a significant amount of axolotls don't survive to adulthood. This is a particular problem when you consider their endangered status in the wild. As with many areas of life, axolotls are their own subgenre of biological marvels. Take, for instance, their ability to regenerate lost body parts. In nature and much of the scientific world, this ability is known as regeneration. This is the word we use for what might seem like a superpower to us humans. Also, whether it's situated in a lab or in the wild, scientists and enthusiasts also can't agree on what you call that stage of the axolotl's life when it's neither a larva nor a fully grown adult. In biology, we usually opt for the word juvenile. Please note that axolotl enthusiasts, just like patrons on my most recent secret stream, are divided on whether this should be pronounced juvenile or juvenile. Either way, scientists will often call this stage the sub-adult phase. More often than not, axolotls will reach sexual maturity at around 5 to 6 months of age. Americans have about 100 words for a fully grown axolotl. Chief among these are neotenic adult, aquatic salamander, Mexican walking fish, or simply axolotl. And finally, metamorphosis. This is something I've encountered far more in textbooks than I have in nature. This is a process in which an axolotl transforms into a terrestrial salamander, but the use of metamorphosis might be confusing to some axolotl fans. You might think of metamorphosis, often pronounced metamorphosis, as something that happens to all salamanders, a fine example of which is the transformation of a tadpole into a frog that I somehow keep mentioning in my videos just by coincidence. That's it for this video. Let me know in the comments below some of the axolotl facts that you've encountered. I'm Alex Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that my videos don't get lost in the pond. Thank you to my patrons for literally making this video happen. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so today at patreon.com/LostInThePond. Until the next video, goodbye.